The Premier of Western Australia is the head of the executive branch of government in the Australian state of Western Australia. The Premier has similar functions in Western Australia to those performed by the Prime Minister of Australia at the national level, subject to the different constitutions. The incumbent Premier of Western Australia is Mark McGowan, who won the 2017 state election and was sworn in on the 17th of March 2017 by Governor Kerry Sanderson as the 30th Premier of Western Australia. The Premier must be a member of one of the two houses of the Parliament of Western Australia. And by convention the Premier is a member of the lower house, the Legislative Assembly. He or she is appointed by the Governor on the advice of the lower house, and must resign if he or she loses the support of the majority of that house. Consequently, the Premier is almost always the leader of the political party or coalition of parties with a majority of seats in the lower house. The office of Premier of Western Australia was first formed in 1890. After Western Australia was officially granted responsible government by Britain in 1889. The Constitution of Western Australia does not explicitly provide for a Premier, and the office was not formally listed as one of the executive officers until the appointment of Ross McLarty in 1947. Nonetheless, John Forrest immediately adopted the title on taking office as first Premier of Western Australia in 1890, and it has been used ever since. John Forrest was the only Premier of Western Australia as a self-governing colony. Following the Federation of Australia in 1901, Western Australia became an Australian state and the responsibilities of the office of Premier were diminished. Party politics began in Western Australia with the rise of the Labor Party in 1901. By 1904, the party system was entrenched in Western Australian politics. Since then the premiers have been associated with political parties. Western Australia's constitution contains nothing to preclude the Premier being a member of the upper house, the Western Australian Legislative Council, historically and by convention. However, the Premier is a member of the Assembly. The only exception has been Hal Colbach, a member of the Legislative Council who accepted the premiership in April 1919 on the understanding that an assembly seat would be found for him, only to resign a month later when no seat could be found. During the economic boom of the 1980s, the Western Australian government became closely involved with a number of large businesses. A succession of deals were made between the government and businesses, and these ultimately caused great losses for the state. A subsequent Royal Commission found evidence of widespread corruption. 3 former premiers were found to have acted improperly and 2 of them, Ray O'Connor and Brian Burke, were jailed. This scandal became popularly known as WA. As of the 18th of March 2021, 7 former premiers are alive, the oldest being Peter Dowding, who served from 1988 to 1990. The most recent premier to die was Ray O'Connor, on the 25th of February 2013, aged 86. The only premier to serve in the upper house while premier was Sir Hal Colbach, who was elected by the Nationalist Party to fill the vacancy presented by the resignation of Henry Lefroy, on the condition that a seat in the lower house would be found for him. He served as premier for a month before resigning after no seat could be found. Prior to the 1904 election, no organised political parties existed, other than the Labour Party. Parliamentary factions included the Ministerialist, or pro-Forest, faction, and the Opposition, or pro-Leak, faction. Leak died in office on the 24th of June 1902 from complications resulting from pneumonia. But the new Walter James-led ministry was not sworn in until the 1st of July 1902. Walter Kingsmill served as acting premier during this time. Gladys Berejiklian, Daniel Andrews, Anastasia Palashchuk, Mark McGowan, Stephen Marshall, Peter Gutwein, Andrew Barr, Michael Gunner.